Mairead McGuinness joins me now, MEP and Vice President of the European Parliament. Also, of course, a farmer, or at least married to a farmer, I know, and with a degree in agricultural economics. And Mairead, you're talking about trade to the forum. This is the 8th forum for the future of agriculture. You've been to many. You've heard the vogue concepts maybe come in, come out. In terms of trade, what is meaningful to the European Parliament when we think of TTIP? We think of barriers, we think of tariffs, we think of those things. Where are you at on the topic?
There's a very funny attitude to the T word, the trade word, and a particularly divided view of TTIP, which is what we're doing, talking to the US about a trade and investment partnership. I was in Washington recently, and can I just say that in the US there is no political interest in TTIP. Here we are enormously excited and indeed troubled by TTIP, so I'm worried that we're out of sync. Even as the negotiations continue, we're on the 8th round. The US is much more interested in their negotiations with the Pacific region. They're on the 38th round. Step back from all of that, and I take the view that if European agriculture is to grow and prosper, and that's what we're talking about, we need trade. I come from a small member state, Ireland. We export most of what we produce, so we live by trade. I think that if we can negotiate trade agreements that take account of and do not dilute our very high standards of animal welfare, of production, of the precautionary principle, and we can access markets and get rid of ridiculous regulation, then I'm all for that. But I'd have to say that the view in the Parliament is quite cool. There's a lot of concern around what a trade agreement with the US and indeed elsewhere might mean for European standards. I would like to think that we wouldn't make up our mind until we see what our negotiators come back with, and then let's decide. So I'm much more open on trade than perhaps other colleagues are.
Maybe they're not clues, maybe they're political animals, you are too, but maybe you're coming at it with a farmer's hat on in terms of just the economics of it, because trade agreements, they are political things, and there are big ifs that you talked about, things like diluting standards, safety, they are huge concerns, and they make it political, and that means trouble.
Yeah, but I wouldn't sit here and defend any dilution of our standards, and I will not vote for anything like that, and ultimately I will have a vote. It's the one thing that the European Parliament has got to do is ratify. But I will say that it isn't just about agriculture. I think agriculture has got to be mindful of this. There are many areas where the EU and the US could do much better on regulation, not looking into each other's systems because they're quite similar, but in looking at systems elsewhere like China and India, where we're not focusing enough attention on in pharma and medical devices and those sectors. So the reason I'm open to this possibility is that I do believe that trade has the capacity to raise standards, not dilute them. And I can tell you 100% that nobody in the European Parliament, having fought for high standards in our food production, will vote for their dilution. So that's not even on the table. Issues like hormone beef, not on the table. GM is another very sensitive issue, not on the table. But there are other areas, in dairy, for example, where Europe could have potential opportunities. The US has just opened its market for beef. Ireland is already can export there. We're concerned, though, in the future about our suckler beef herds. So it's not a black and white issue. It's extraordinarily complex, and it's not all about agriculture, but agriculture, in my view, cannot be sacrificed. I've always made that point. And I think the contribution that I'm making to this debate is to say, look, let's take it in the round here. Let's look at what might be beneficial for both the US and the EU as world leaders in agricultural production, and the EU has a world leader in environmental standards, and let's set the bar high for the rest of the world to follow. I mean, there's as much opportunity out of this, I believe, as there are potential downsides, but quite frankly, the mood in Parliament and indeed among many citizens at the moment is quite negative about a trade agreement with the US, and that said, in the US, they're not as perplexed about it as we are, and perhaps we should be more mindful of that.
one thing you've always talked about is, being able to share knowledge in forums like this and how important it is. We talk about knowledge per hectare, and as opposed to inputs per hectare, raising the knowledge so that we can produce more with less and make sure that we protect the environment. And that's still the theme that it was at the first forum, and we're now on the 8th.
Kind of boring, but actually essential. This idea of sustainable intensification. So we do less harm, we use less, and we get more from our efforts. You'll only do that with knowledge. That's across every single industry we have. It's particularly so in agriculture. And I would make the point, and if I've said it before, I'm going to say it again, knowledge transfer, the getting of scientific information to a practical field level into the farm households and applied is where we will win this debate.
Fast broadband required for that? Because we've been talking about the Internet of Things was one of the things that Jeremy Rifkin came up with.
I mean, you see farmers of 80 plus able to use mobile phones because they deliver results for them.
And that's precision farming right there with a smartphone.
Farmers will adopt technology because it delivers for them. But if you don't have broadband, I'm afraid you're outside the loop. These things will come though. Electrification came. I mean, when you look back now, and many of us don't even remember a time when there wasn't electricity. Broadband, in my view, is the very same thing as rural electrification. It will come, but it needs to come much quicker. But equally, farmers who invest need to get a return. And I come back to this time and time and time again. We have to find a way of making farming pay better for farming families, because they're the backbone of the European agriculture sector, and they're the backbone of world agriculture. They stay farming sometimes even when the return on investment is quite low, but they will not do it generation after generation. But I'm hopeful, because I see a whole new group of men and women coming into agriculture.
We've talked about women today. We've talked about women with the UN.
I saw very nice tweets about women being more, not sustainable isn't the word, but being more into and delivering on sustainability.
Well, things like they understand the circular economy just because that's a way of...
It's a way of being.
Way of being and multitasking and such. Yeah. Needing to farm profitably, though, is still always one of those.
I mean, I suppose the one thing that disappoints me about the forum, and I've only been following it, most of it on Twitter, is that we still have this polarised debate, organic versus conventional, beef versus grain, instead of a more holistic approach. I would like to think we could take the best of the practices of organic farming and use them in conventional and swap information and advice, because I think we all want the same thing. I mean, clearly the issue around pesticides and chemical inputs into agriculture is extraordinarily sensitive, and the public have concerns around it, and I think that will intensify. And yet my farmers are saying, how can we deal with our weather conditions without having resort to these valuable inputs and valuable chemistry? Equally, how do we persuade the industry that supplies inputs to agriculture to invest if they feel their products will not be used and will not get a place on the market? So there's an enormous array of challenges for the agri-food sector. But every time I come here, I suppose you learn more, which is what we're all here for. I'm probably more hopeful than maybe at the first one. I think the fact that the world is looking at agriculture and food in a way of the future rather than the past is hugely encouraging. And I suppose to those who are involved in the 8th forum, fair play for sticking with it, because it's a big investment in all our futures.
Can I just ask you as an aside, because we're talking about trade? Mm-hmm. The UK is just a trade partner, but not a member state. What do you think of Mr. Cameron's point of view?
I mean, look where I sit from a national point of view, and I'm an Irish Member of Parliament. We're big traders with the UK, and they trade with us. We want them in the European Union, full players, with all other 27 member states. But look, they're in the middle of an election campaign. Let's see what happens.
Mairead, thank you. Enjoy the forum today.
Well, thank you.